Hello, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me on today. We're going to go on ahead and jump right into it. Today's message is entitled The Screaming Lady of Oakwood. Way back when I was in college, I attended a church called Oakwood. And I remember my very first Sabbath in the church. It was very crowded. Oakwood Church is very, very big. I began to hear screams in the back. And there were so many people at the church that when I would look around to see where the source of the screams was coming from, I couldn't make heads or tail of who it belonged to. I just remember service after service, Sabbath after Sabbath, I would hear these high-pitched screams from the back. It didn't matter if it was tithes and offering time. It didn't matter if it was praise and worship, if it was benediction, or if it was smack dab in the middle of a full-blown sermon. There was a screaming lady in the back. I will never forget the way that she made me feel. At first, I was scared. I thought that something happened, and I still just couldn't seem to understand it. And in my ignorance, my friends and I would kind of snicker. We would kind of laugh at her, and oh, she's crazy, that crazy screaming lady in the back. To this day, fast forward all these years, I will never forget the screaming lady of Oakwood. All these years later, I now understand the reason for the scream. The screaming lady taught me 4 things, which I'm going to share with you today. Number 1, the scream releases emotions. The scream releases built up frustration that we have within ourselves. The scream is a powerful language that only the Holy Spirit can translate. And when we scream, when we let that out, we are letting out either it's praise and worship, or we are letting out the alarm for, hey, we need help. That is the first thing I learned from her. The second thing I learned from her, which is germinated today, is the scream, it plants seeds. It plants seeds in the hearers of those around about that are listening to the scream. If it wasn't for her screaming way back then that planted a seed within me, which is producing fruit today, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the woman with the scream. Another thing is that the scream, it produces an activation. It activates an atmospheric shift, if you may. It makes people uncomfortable. It makes people kind of be on the edge of their seat. The scream, it takes a mundane service and it takes it to a spiritual level. It leaves the hearers of the scream in a place of what is going on. Let's go on ahead and say what really is the most important part of the scream. The scream represents freedom. That woman in the back, the screaming woman, she didn't care about what others thought of her. She didn't care about what they would say about her afterwards. She didn't care about the snickering college kids. She didn't care about anything. She was completely free in her worship. She was liberated spiritually, not to care about what others thought or perceived her as. She would yell out. And for Sabbath after Sabbath, she exhibited a freedom that a lot of us just don't have. Let's go on ahead and switch gears completely. Let's talk about the top 5 screamers of the Bible. You heard me, the top 5 screamers of the Bible. Y'all, competition was stiff. During my research, there was at least 12 to 15 top screamers, but for time's purpose, I can't mention all of them, so I've narrowed it down to 5. I want to give you the top 5 screamers of the Bible. We're going to start with number 5. Number 5 is Gideon and his army. Gideon was called from a place of being of thrashing wheat. He was like a farmer. He didn't have a whole lot of title. He was called by God to head an army, and this army was outnumbered. And God gave him direction, and this is actually taken from Judges chapter 7 verses 20. Feel free to go back and read it for yourself. But Gideon and his army screamed out to God, and God heard them and delivered them from what they were up against at the present. Number 4 was King David. You knew I had to put King David on there. King David, as I'm thinking about King David, I couldn't really pinpoint a book, a chapter, a verse. King David had a lot going on, but I can direct you to the book of Psalms. And if you want to get particular, I was battling between chapter 69 and chapter 88 when David was fully screaming out to God. He did that quite often. If you read the book, if you read the other things that he has mentioned, and David definitely makes the top 5 lists of screamers. The next one, I could not leave her out. This is the woman with the issue of blood. They don't mention her name in scriptures, but while she was pursuing after God in the physical, she was crying out. She was screaming after him. She was so loud that his disciples around about him said, Lord, please send her away. She is screaming and making all this noise. This is taken from Matthew 15:23. All right, number 2. And number 2 is one of my favorites, King Jehoshaphat. He has an entire passage to a prayer that he had prayed to God. And in the prayer, I know there were some cries. I know there were some screams. If you would go to, in your own time, go to 2 Chronicles chapter 20. To make a really long story short, King Jehoshaphat and the nation of Israel, they were up against enemies of a foreign land coming, and they were way outnumbered. They were outnumbered by horses and chariots of men, and the only thing they had was a scream. It was a prayer, and God delivered them from all those armies that came. It was a group of people. It wasn't just one army. It was groups of armies that came to the children of Israel, and them crying out to God. That's what saved an entire nation, was a scream. I'm telling you about the power of a scream. Number 1, you guys are probably thinking, who is number 1? Who is the top screamer of the Bible? I had to throw him in here. It was Jesus. Jesus was a screamer. If we look to Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7, I'm going to read this passage. And it says, I'm paraphrasing, with loud and vehement cries, he made his request known to the Father. Vehement, to my understanding, is a fancy term for saying he was passionately screaming. And he was screaming as he was agonizing with God about what he knew was fixing to happen. So I want to my encouragement for you today is, come on with your scream. Don't feel insecure about your scream. Be free in your scream. There are people that need to hear your scream. If it was not for that scream, you would not be receiving the message that I am giving to you today. If I could meet, I never saw her face, but if I could ever see the screaming lady of Oakwood, I would tell her, I would say thank you. I would say thank you for the scream. There is a power within the scream. I am Nikki the Great, and together we are growing, sharing, and thriving.